The stagecoach rattled to a halt, dust billowing around its wooden wheels as Julia Whitfield clutched her small valise tightly against her chest. After 3 weeks of grueling travel from Boston to Colorado Territory, her journey was nearly complete. The year was 1875, and at 22, Julia had made the boldest decision of her sheltered life, answering an advertisement for a mail-order bride to a cattle rancher named Daniel Jackson in Gunnison County. Last stop before Gunnison. The driver called out, his voice carrying on the crisp mountain air. 15-minute rest, folks. Julia stepped down onto Colorado soil, her legs unsteady after hours of confinement. The small way station consisted of little more than a trading post and a water trough, but the majestic Rocky Mountains rising in the distance took her breath away. She had never seen anything so vast, so untamed. "First time in the West, madam?" asked a weathered man leaning against the station wall. "Is it that obvious?" Julia attempted a smile, smoothing down her travel-worn navy dress. "Got that look about you. Eyes all wide like you can't quite believe what you're seeing," he chuckled. "Where you headed?" "I'm to meet my future husband, Daniel Jackson of Gunnison." The man's expression shifted, his smile fading. "Jackson's place out on Elk Creek?" "Yes, that's right." Julia felt a flutter of unease. "Do you know him?" The man removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Madam, I don't rightly know how to tell you this, but there was trouble out that way about a week ago." Julia's heart quickened. "What kind of trouble?" Before he could answer, the driver called for everyone to board. The man just shook his head and said, "Best you speak to Sheriff Mills when you get to town." The remaining hours of the journey passed in anxious silence. Julia had exchanged letters with Daniel Jackson for 6 months before agreeing to marry him. His words had painted pictures of a prosperous ranch, a comfortable home, and a life where she might find purpose after losing her parents to influenza the previous winter. With no family left and facing the prospect of becoming a burden to distant relatives, she had chosen this path, this unknown future. The town of Gunnison came into view as the stagecoach crested a hill, a collection of wooden structures nestled in a valley, with mountains standing sentinel on all sides. It was smaller than Julia had imagined, but there was something appealing about its frontier simplicity. Gunnison. "End of the line," the driver announced as they pulled up to the station. Julia gathered her belongings, one trunk containing everything she deemed important enough to bring to her new life. As she stood on the boardwalk, uncertain where to go next, a man in a sheriff's badge approached her. "You look a bit lost, miss. Can I help you find someone? I'm Julia Whitfield. I've come to marry Daniel Jackson." The sheriff's face fell, and Julia felt her stomach twist into knots. "Miss Whitfield, I think you'd better come with me to my office." Sheriff Mills led her down the main street, past curious onlookers, to a small wooden building with "Sheriff" painted on the window. Inside, he offered her a seat and poured her a cup of coffee from a pot on the stove. "Miss Whitfield, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. There was a fire at the Jackson Ranch last week. Lightning strike hit the barn, and with the drought we've been having, it spread faster than anyone could contain it." Julia's hands trembled around the coffee cup. "And Mr. Jackson, is he?" "He's alive," the sheriff assured her quickly. "But his cabin and most of his outbuildings were destroyed. He lost a good portion of his livestock, too. He's been staying with the Petersons, neighbors about 5 miles from his place." Relief washed over Julia, followed quickly by concern. "I should go to him then. He'll be expecting me." Sheriff Mills hesitated. "Miss Whitfield, given the circumstances, no one would think less of you if you decided to return east. The man you agreed to marry had a prosperous ranch. Now he's got little more than the land and whatever cattle survived." Julia straightened her spine. "Sheriff, I came here to marry Mr. Jackson, not his property. If he still wishes to have me, then I intend to honor our agreement." A slow smile spread across the sheriff's weathered face. "I was hoping you'd say that. Jackson's a good man who's had more than his share of hardship. I'll send word to the Peterson place that you've arrived, and we'll arrange transportation for tomorrow morning. Tonight, you can stay at the boarding house. Mrs. Cooper runs a decent establishment." The following morning, Julia sat rigid on the seat of a wagon driven by a young man introduced as Tommy Peterson. They had been traveling for nearly 2 hours, leaving the town far behind, following a winding trail through pine-covered hills and open meadows where cattle grazed. "That's our place," Tommy said, pointing to a homestead in the distance. "And just beyond that ridge is what's left of the Jackson Ranch. Pa says Mr. Jackson's been working from sunup till sundown trying to salvage what he can." As they approached the Peterson farm, Julia saw a man straighten from his work on a fence line. Even from a distance, she recognized him from the small daguerreotype he had sent her, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair beneath his worn hat. Tommy pulled the wagon to a stop. "Mr. Jackson." "Got someone here to see you." Daniel Jackson set down his tools and walked toward them, wiping his hands on his denims. As he drew closer, Julia saw the exhaustion etched into his sun-bronzed face, the worry lines around his blue eyes. He stopped abruptly when he recognized her, removing his hat in one swift motion. "Miss Whitfield, I didn't expect," he faltered. "I sent a letter to Boston 2 days ago explaining what happened. I assumed you'd want to reconsider our arrangement." Julia climbed down from the wagon without assistance, facing the man she had agreed to marry. "The letter hadn't reached Boston before I departed, Mr. Jackson." He looked at her directly then, and Julia saw shame and pride battling in his expression. "Miss Whitfield, what I promised you no longer exists. My home, most of my cattle, my means to provide a proper life, it's gone." "Perhaps we should see it," Julia suggested quietly. "Your land." Daniel hesitated before nodding. "Tommy, would you mind taking us over to my property?" The ruins of the Jackson Ranch came into view as they crested a gentle hill. Where a cabin should have stood was a blackened rectangle of stone foundation. The charred remains of a barn listed to one side, and the corral fencing was partially destroyed. But beyond the devastation stretched acres of grassland bordered by forest, and a creek glimmered in the sunlight as it wound through the property. Tommy stopped the wagon at a respectful distance. "I'll wait here, give you folks some privacy." Daniel helped Julia down, his touch tentative. They walked in silence toward the ruins, and Julia felt his tension with every step. "This was to be your home," he said finally, gesturing to the foundation. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid. 3 rooms, a good stone fireplace that kept it warm even in the worst blizzards. Julia looked around, trying to imagine what it had been, what it could be again. "And the land is still yours?" "Yes, 160 acres. Good water, good grazing. I've got about 30 head of cattle left out of nearly 100. He paused, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "Miss Whitfield, I can't ask you to stay. You came expecting a home, and all I can offer now is hardship." Julia turned to face him fully. In his letters, Daniel had been forthright and honest, never pretending to offer romance, only partnership and respect. She had admired that quality in him then, and she saw it now in the way he refused to give her false hope. "Mr. Jackson," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "when my parents died last winter, I lost everything that mattered to me. My home was sold to pay their debts, and I learned that security can vanish in an instant." She gestured to the burned foundation. "This is terrible, yes. But it's not the end unless you choose to make it so. His eyes, the color of the Colorado sky, studied her with cautious hope. "What are you saying?" Julia took a deep breath. "I'm saying that if you still wish to marry me, I'm willing to face this challenge with you." "I didn't come all this way for a house, Mr. Jackson." Daniel stared at the ruins of his home, then back at Julia. His expression softened as he took a step closer to her. "Then we'll build one together." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, a promise that encompassed far more than constructing a physical shelter. It was a commitment to build a life, a future, from the ashes of what had been lost. "I won't pretend it will be easy," Daniel continued. "We'll have to start with a temporary shelter until I can rebuild properly. The Petersons have offered to let us stay with them, but you'd rather be on your own land," Julia finished for him. "As would I." For the first time since she'd met him, Daniel smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weary face. "You're nothing like I expected, Miss Whitfield." "I hope that's not a disappointment," she replied, returning his smile with a small one of her own. "Quite the opposite." He hesitated before extending his hand to her. "If we're to be married, perhaps you should call me Daniel." Julia placed her gloved hand in his. "And I'm Julia." The simple exchange felt momentous, like the first true connection between them, not words on paper, but flesh and blood. Two people standing amid devastation, yet choosing to see possibility. "Daniel," Tommy called from the wagon, "Pa says if you're still planning to get married today, Reverend Simmons can come out to our place this evening. Ma's already baking a cake." Daniel looked questioningly at Julia. "It wouldn't be the wedding I promised you. No proper church, no new dress." "I think a simple ceremony would be fitting," Julia replied. "We can have a more formal celebration when we've rebuilt." The wedding took place that evening on the Petersons' front porch, with the family serving as witnesses. Julia wore her best dress, a pale blue cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, while Daniel had borrowed a clean shirt and shaved his trail, weary face. Reverend Simmons performed a brief but heartfelt ceremony as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "By the power vested in me," the Reverend concluded, "I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Jackson." Daniel hesitated, acutely aware of their audience and the fact that this woman, now his wife, was still largely a stranger. He settled for a gentle, chaste kiss that barely brushed Julia's lips, but was enough to seal their contract in the eyes of God and the law. Mrs. Peterson served a simple but hearty wedding supper, and neighbors from nearby homesteads arrived with gifts, practical items for a couple starting with nothing. Julia was touched by the generosity of these strangers who had welcomed her so readily into their community. As the evening drew to a close, the inevitable awkwardness of a mail-order marriage settled upon the newlyweds. Mrs. Peterson had prepared a small bedroom for them, and as they stood alone together for the first time, Julia felt her confidence waver. "I'll sleep on the floor," Daniel said immediately, sensing her discomfort. "You take the bed." "That hardly seems fair," Julia protested. "You've been working yourself to exhaustion." "Julia," he said gently, "we may have said vows today, but we're still getting to know one another. I won't rush you into anything you're not ready for." Relief and gratitude washed over her. In her darkest moments of doubt during her journey west, Julia had feared that the man she was to marry might be crude or demanding. Instead, Daniel was showing her a consideration she hadn't dared hope for. "Thank you," she whispered, and for the second time that day she saw his genuine smile. The following morning they began the work of rebuilding their life together. Daniel had salvaged some tools from the fire, and with Tommy Peterson's help, they constructed a temporary shelter near the creek, a simple one-room structure of canvas stretched over a wooden frame. "It's not much," Daniel apologized as they prepared to spend their first night on their own land. "But it will keep the rain off until I can build something more substantial." "It's a beginning," Julia said, arranging their few belongings in the confined space. She had sewn curtains from fabric Mrs. Peterson had given her and hung them at the single window, a small touch of domesticity in their makeshift home. That night, lying on their separate pallets, the canvas walls rustling in the gentle breeze, Julia listened to Daniel's breathing and wondered what the future held. They were husband and wife, yet barely knew each other beyond what they had shared in letters. "Are you awake?" Daniel's voice came softly through the darkness. "Yes," Julia admitted. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for staying, for believing we could rebuild." Julia turned on her side, though she could barely make out his silhouette in the darkness. "Tell me about your plans for the ranch." Daniel began to speak, his voice growing animated as he described his vision: a larger cabin with proper bedrooms, an expanded herd of cattle, fields of hay, perhaps even horses to breed. As he talked, Julia heard the passion beneath his practical words, and she realized that this land was more than property to him. It was his dream, his purpose. "What about you?" he asked finally. "What made you decide to come west as a mail-order bride?" Julia was silent for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "After my parents died, I worked as a seamstress in Boston. The pay was poor, the hours long, and there was little hope of improvement when I saw your advertisement." She paused. "Your letter was honest. You didn't make grand promises you couldn't keep. You wanted a partner, not an ornament or a servant. And now I've brought you to a tent instead of a home," he said ruefully. "I've made my choice, Daniel," Julia replied firmly. "I would rather build something meaningful here than return to a life of quiet desperation in Boston." In the darkness, Daniel's hand found hers, a tentative touch that she didn't pull away from. They fell asleep that way, connected by the smallest of gestures, the beginning of a trust that would need to grow if they were to face the challenges ahead. The days that followed fell into a pattern of hard work and gradual adjustment. Each morning, Daniel rode out to check on the remaining cattle, while Julia established their camp as a functional home. She cooked over an open fire, washed their clothes in the creek, and began planning a garden that would supplement their provisions. A week after their wedding, Daniel returned from town with a wagon loaded with lumber. "Borrowed money against next year's cattle," he explained as Julia helped him unload. "I can't have my wife living in a tent when winter comes." Together, they marked out the foundation for their new cabin, larger than the original, with space for the family they hoped to have someday. Daniel worked from dawn till dusk, and Julia learned to assist him, holding boards steady while he hammered, mixing mortar for the stone fireplace, and keeping him company during the long hours of labor. As June turned to July, the skeleton of their new home began to take shape. The Petersons and other neighbors came for a raising, helping to erect the frame and roof in a single day of communal effort. Julia cooked for the hungry workers, and as she watched Daniel directing the construction, she felt a swell of pride in this man who refused to be defeated by disaster. That night, as they sat before their campfire, exhausted but satisfied with the day's progress, Daniel reached for her hand. "We should be able to move in before the first snow," he said. "It won't be finished, no proper floors or plastered walls, but it will be sturdy." "It will be home," Julia said simply. Daniel's eyes reflected the firelight as he studied her face. "You've never complained, not once, about any of this. Most women would have been on the first stage back east." "I'm not most women," Julia replied with a small smile. "No," he agreed softly, "you're not." When he kissed her this time, it wasn't the brief, ceremonial gesture of their wedding day. It was a real kiss, gentle at first, then deepening as Julia responded to him. She felt the calluses on his hands as they framed her face, the strength in his arms as they encircled her. When they finally drew apart, both were breathless. "I'm sorry," Daniel started to apologize. "I didn't mean to." Julia silenced him with a finger to his lips. "Don't be sorry, I'm your wife." That night, they shared a pallet for the first time, and Julia discovered that Daniel's gentleness extended to the most intimate aspects of their relationship. Afterward, lying in his arms as the embers of their fire died down, she felt a contentment she had never expected to find in this harsh, beautiful land with a man who had been a stranger mere weeks ago. As summer progressed, so did the construction of their cabin. Daniel proved to be skilled with tools, having built his first home himself 5 years earlier when he'd claimed the land. Julia's days were filled with domestic tasks, but she also began venturing into town occasionally, getting to know the other women in the community. Mrs. Cooper, who ran the boarding house, became a particular friend, teaching Julia the practical skills of frontier life that her Boston upbringing hadn't prepared her for: how to preserve food for winter, how to treat common ailments when a doctor might be days away, how to manage when supplies ran low. "You're adapting well," Mrs. Cooper remarked one afternoon as they worked together canning vegetables from her garden. "Some Eastern women never do." "I want to be useful to Daniel," Julia explained. "He works so hard and I need to do my part." Mrs. Cooper smiled knowingly. "It's more than duty I see in your eyes when you speak of your husband. You're falling in love with him." The observation startled Julia. Was that what was happening? She had entered into marriage with Daniel as a practical arrangement, but the woman was right: something had changed. She looked forward to his return each evening, missed him when he was gone for more than a day, and felt a flutter in her chest whenever he smiled at her. "Is that so strange?" she asked finally. "To fall in love with one's husband after the wedding?" "Not strange at all, dear Mrs. Cooper assured her. "Some might say it's the most natural thing in the world." That evening, as Daniel worked on fitting the door to their nearly complete cabin, Julia watched him with new awareness. The strength in his shoulders as he planed the wood, the concentration in his face, the gentleness with which he handled the tools, all of these had become dear to her. "What is it?" he asked, catching her gaze. "Nothing," she said quickly. "Just thinking how much has changed since I arrived." Daniel set down his tools and crossed to where she stood. "Do you regret it, coming here?" "No," Julia answered without hesitation. "I only regret that it took a disaster for me to discover what truly matters." He touched her cheek, a tender gesture that had become familiar between them. "And what is that? Not the house or the possessions," she said softly, "but the person you're building a life with." Daniel's eyes darkened with emotion. "Julia, I need to tell you something. When I placed that advertisement for a mail-order bride, I was thinking practically I needed a wife to help run the ranch, to cook and keep house, perhaps bear children someday." He took a deep breath. "But these past weeks with you, seeing your strength and courage, your willingness to face hardship without complaint, I find myself wanting more than just a practical arrangement." Julia's heart quickened. "What do you want, Daniel?" "I want a true marriage," he said simply. "I want to be a husband who deserves the wife you've proven to be. I think," he paused, as if gathering courage, "I think I'm falling in love with you, Julia." The admission, spoken in the half-built cabin that represented their future, brought tears to Julia's eyes. "I feel the same," she whispered. "I didn't expect to, but I do." When he kissed her this time, it was with the newfound certainty of mutual affection, not just duty or physical attraction. They made love there, on a blanket spread across the rough-hewn floorboards of their unfinished home, consummating not just their legal union but the emotional bond that had grown between them. August brought scorching heat, and the threat of another dry lightning storm. Daniel worked frantically to finish the cabin's roof and install the glass windows that had been a considerable expense. Julia helped where she could, but also focused on preparing for winter drying fruits, canning vegetables from their small garden, and making preserves from wild berries she gathered along the creek. "We should be able to move in next week," Daniel announced one evening as they ate their supper outside their tent. "Just in time, too. Smell the air rains coming." Julia nodded, having learned to read the signs of changing weather. The air felt heavy, electric, and clouds were building on the western horizon. "Will it be a bad storm?" "Hard to say," Daniel admitted. "But I've reinforced everything. We won't lose this home, I promise you that." They worked into the night by lantern light, moving what possessions they had into the cabin for safekeeping. When the first fat raindrops began to fall, Daniel insisted they take shelter in the new structure rather than their vulnerable tent. "It's not quite ready," he apologized as they huddled together, listening to the intensifying rainfall on the cedar shake roof. "But at least it's solid." The storm grew in fury, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through the pine trees surrounding their homestead. Lightning split the sky, followed by deafening thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. The cattle, Daniel worried, pacing before the stone fireplace where a small fire burned. "If they stampede in this weather, we could lose them." "There's nothing you can do tonight," Julia reasoned, taking his hand to still his movement. "You'd never find them in this darkness, and you'd risk your own life." He knew she was right, but the strain showed on his face. They had already lost so much. Another setback might prove insurmountable. Julia led him to the simple mattress they had placed in the corner that would eventually become their bedroom, and they lay together, drawing comfort from each other's presence as the storm raged outside. "Tell me about Boston," Daniel said, clearly seeking distraction. "What was your life like there?" Julia described the crowded streets, the elegant shops, the concerts and lectures that had been her occasional treats. "It was exciting in its way, but also confining. Women have such limited choices their marriage or spinsterhood, with few respectable ways to support oneself independently." "And here," Daniel asked, "do you feel you have more freedom or less?" Julia considered the question seriously. "Different freedoms, perhaps. The physical work is harder, the comforts fewer. But there's a directness to life here that I find refreshing. No one cares about your family connections or your social graces. They care if you're honest, hardworking, and willing to help your neighbors." Daniel nodded, his arm tightening around her. "That's what drew me west in the first place. Back in Pennsylvania, my family had worked the same small farm for generations, barely surviving. Out here, a man can build something worthwhile if he's willing to risk everything." "Like you did," Julia murmured. "Like we're doing," he corrected, kissing her forehead. Eventually, the storm began to subside, the spaces between lightning and thunder growing longer, the rain softening to a steady patter rather than a violent deluge. They drifted to sleep in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that their new home had weathered its first test. Dawn revealed a transformed landscape trees down, the creek swollen beyond its banks, but miraculously, their cabin stood unscathed. Daniel rode out immediately to check on the cattle, returning mid-morning with relief evident in his expression. "They sheltered in the South Ravine," he reported as Julia handed him a cup of coffee. "Not a single one lost, and the rain's a blessing for the pasture. It'll green up nicely now." "The garden survived too," Julia added, "though I'll need to stake the tomatoes again." They worked together throughout the day, repairing minor storm damage and continuing the interior work on their cabin. By evening, exhausted but satisfied, They officially moved out of the tent that had been their home for nearly 2 months. "Welcome home, Mrs. Jackson," Daniel said formally, lifting Julia across the threshold of their new front door. She laughed at the gesture but was touched by its significance. "It's wonderful," she said, looking around at the simple space. One main room with the stone fireplace, a small bedroom partitioned off for them, and space for additional rooms to be finished later. The furniture was sparse: a table and chairs Daniel had made, a bed, some shelves, but to Julia, it represented a miracle of perseverance. "We still need proper floors," Daniel pointed out, "and the interior walls need to be finished before winter, but it's a start." "It's more than that," Julia said, wrapping her arms around his waist. "It's proof of what we can accomplish together." As September arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color to the aspens on the hillsides, their cabin continued to improve. Julia sewed curtains and cushions, creating touches of comfort in their rustic home. Daniel completed a stone root cellar where they stored their preserved foods, and began constructing furniture: a rocking chair for Julia, a chest for their clothing, shelves for her growing collection of books ordered from Denver. They established routines that suited them both: rising before dawn, sharing the day's work according to their strengths, and ending each evening together before the fireplace, talking about their dreams for the future. What had begun as a practical arrangement had blossomed into a partnership based on genuine affection and mutual respect. One crisp October morning, as Daniel prepared to ride into town for supplies, Julia felt suddenly lightheaded. She steadied herself against the table, hoping he hadn't noticed, but Daniel's concerned expression told her otherwise. "Are you unwell?" he asked, immediately at her side. "Just a momentary dizziness," she assured him. "I'm fine now." But the symptoms continued over the following days: nausea in the mornings, fatigue by mid-afternoon, certain foods suddenly unappetizing. When Mrs. Cooper visited to teach Julia the art of making soap, she observed these changes with knowing eyes. "How long has it been since your monthly courses?" she asked directly as they worked together. Julia blushed at the personal question, then did a quick calculation. 6 weeks, perhaps. With everything that's happened, I haven't kept careful track." Mrs. Cooper smiled gently. "I think you might be expecting, my dear." The possibility hadn't occurred to Julia, but as soon as the words were spoken, she knew they were true. A baby, Daniel's child, growing inside her. The thought filled her with both joy and apprehension. "Daniel will be pleased, I think," she said softly. "He's mentioned wanting children." "Most men do," Mrs. Cooper agreed. "But are you ready, Julia? A winter pregnancy in these conditions won't be easy." "I've faced worse challenges," Julia replied with newfound confidence. "And I won't be alone." That evening, as they sat together after supper, Julia gathered her courage. "Daniel, I have news," she began, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her apron. He looked up from the harness he was repairing, immediately attentive. "What is it?" "I believe that is Mrs. Cooper thinks." Julia took a deep breath. "I'm going to have a baby, our baby." Daniel went completely still, the harness forgotten in his hands. Then his face transformed with a smile of such radiant happiness that Julia felt tears spring to her eyes. "A baby," he repeated in wonder. "Julia, that's miraculous." He crossed to her chair and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "When? How soon?" "Early spring, I think," Julia calculated. "April, perhaps." Daniel pressed a hand gently against her still flat stomach, awe in his expression. "Our child," he whispered, "growing right here." "Are you truly happy about this?" Julia asked. "With everything else we're facing?" "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," Daniel replied fervently. "When I lost nearly everything in that fire, I thought my dreams for this place were finished." Then you arrived, refusing to be defeated, and gave me hope again. He swallowed hard. Now you're giving me a family too. Julia, I love you. I love you with everything I am. It was the first time he had said those words so directly, and Julia felt them resonate through her entire being. I love you too, Daniel, she replied, meaning it with her whole heart. More than I ever thought possible. The months that followed were filled with preparation not just for winter, but for the child who would join their family in the spring. Daniel worked feverishly to complete additional improvements to the cabin, insulating the walls with layers of newspaper between boards, finishing the floors with smooth planks, and building a cradle from wood he had carefully seasoned. Julia sewed constantly baby clothes, blankets, diapers, all while managing their household and adjusting to the changes in her body. Her slender frame gradually rounded with pregnancy, and Daniel watched the transformation with undisguised adoration. You've never been more beautiful, he told her one December evening as she sat by the fire, her hands resting on her growing belly. Julia laughed. I waddle like a duck and can barely see my feet. Nevertheless, he insisted, kneeling beside her chair to place his hand alongside hers, you're beautiful and strong. Our child is fortunate to have you as a mother. The winter of 1875-76 proved to be harsh, with snowdrifts sometimes reaching the cabin's windowsills and temperatures falling to bitter lows. Daniel kept the fireplace burning constantly and made trips to town whenever the weather permitted, always returning with some small treat for Julia: peppermint sticks, a new hair ribbon, or once, miraculously, an orange that must have cost a small fortune to transport from warmer climes. Cut off from neighbors for days at a time, they grew even closer, reading aloud to each other in the evenings, playing chess on a board Daniel carved, and talking endlessly about their hopes for their child. If it's a boy, Daniel mused one night, we could name him after your father. William, Julia nodded. And if it's a girl, perhaps Elizabeth, after your mother. Daniel smiled, pleased by her thoughtfulness. Elizabeth Jackson has a nice sound to it. As February turned to March, and the worst of winter began to loosen its grip, Julia felt increasing anticipation and anxiety. The nearest doctor was in Gunnison, a journey that might be impossible depending on the weather when her time came. Mrs. Peterson has delivered half the babies in the county, Daniel reassured her when she voiced her concerns. And Mrs. Cooper has already promised to come stay with us when you're close to your time. Still, as her body grew more unwieldy and the baby's movements stronger, Julia found herself plagued by worries. What if something went wrong? What if the baby came early during a spring blizzard? What if she wasn't strong enough? Daniel seemed to sense her unspoken fears. One evening in late March, he sat beside her on their bed, taking her hands in his. Julia, you remember the day you arrived, when you saw the ruins of our home and still chose to stay? She nodded, unsure where he was leading. That day, I saw something in you that I'd never seen in anyone else, a kind of courage that doesn't shout or boast, but simply endures and builds and refuses to surrender. He kissed her hands, one after the other. That's the strength our child will inherit from you, and it's why I have no doubts that you'll be an extraordinary mother. His words calmed her, reminding her of how far they had come since that first meeting. From strangers bound by a practical arrangement to partners who had built a home and a life together, their journey had transformed them both. We've already faced the worst life could throw at us, Julia realized aloud, and we're still standing. More than standing, Daniel agreed. We're thriving. April arrived with gentle rains and new grass greening the pastures. The cattle had survived the winter, thin but healthy, and Daniel was already making plans for expanding the herd. Julia's time grew very near, her body heavy with child, her movements slow and deliberate. Mrs. Cooper arrived as promised, bringing her extensive experience and calm presence to their household. She examined Julia and nodded approvingly. "The baby has dropped into position. It won't be long now." 2 days later, just as dawn was breaking over the eastern ridges, Julia woke to the unmistakable sensation of her waters breaking. "Daniel," she whispered, shaking him gently. "It's time." What followed was a day of pain and endurance unlike anything Julia had ever experienced. Daniel was banished from the bedroom by Mrs. Cooper, but he remained just outside the door, his presence a comfort even when Julia couldn't see him. "You're doing wonderfully," Mrs. Cooper encouraged as the hours passed and the contractions grew more intense. "Your body knows exactly what to do." In the late afternoon, when Julia felt she couldn't possibly continue, Mrs. Cooper announced that it was time to push. "Your baby is ready to meet you," she said firmly. "Just a little more courage now." Summoning her last reserves of strength, Julia bore down with each contraction, Daniel's voice from beyond the door giving her something to focus on besides the pain. And then, miraculously, a new sound filled the cabin, the indignant cry of their child entering the world. "A daughter," Mrs. Cooper announced triumphantly, placing the red-faced, squalling infant on Julia's chest. "A beautiful, perfect daughter." Julia stared in wonder at the tiny being they had created. Daniel's dark hair, her own delicate features, impossibly small fingers grasping at the air. "Elizabeth," she whispered. "Elizabeth Jackson." "Let the man in before he breaks down the door," Mrs. Cooper chuckled, moving to admit Daniel to the room. He entered cautiously, his face etched with concern until he saw Julia holding their daughter. The transformation was instantaneous fear replaced by overwhelming joy as he approached the bed. "Julia," he breathed, unable to take his eyes off the baby. "She's miraculous." "Would you like to hold your daughter?" Julia asked, smiling despite her exhaustion. With infinite care, Daniel took the swaddled infant in his arms, cradling her as if she were made of the most delicate porcelain. "Hello, Elizabeth," he murmured. "I'm your father." The baby quieted at the sound of his deep voice, her tiny face turning toward him instinctively. Daniel looked up at Julia, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." In that moment, gazing at her husband holding their child in the home they had built together from nothing, Julia knew with absolute certainty that every hardship had been worthwhile. Every challenge overcome had strengthened them. Every loss had opened the door to greater gain. "I was thinking," Daniel said softly, returning the baby to Julia's arms, "that when you're recovered, we should plan a proper celebration. Invite everyone who helped us rebuild the Petersons, Sheriff Mills, Reverend Simmons, Mrs. Cooper, of course. A christening for Elizabeth, yes, but also a dedication of our home. A way to thank everyone and mark how far we've come." "I'd like that," Julia agreed, stroking her daughter's soft cheek. "Very much." May brought mild weather and wildflowers carpeting the meadows around their home. Julia recovered her strength quickly, buoyed by Daniel's constant support and the joy of watching their daughter grow. Elizabeth proved to be a good-natured baby, rarely fussing and already showing signs of her parents' determination in her focused gaze and strong grip. The celebration Daniel had suggested took shape as a Sunday gathering following Elizabeth's christening at the small church in Gunnison. Friends and neighbors filled their cabin and spilled onto the porch and yard, everyone bringing food and small gifts for the baby. "Hard to believe this was just burned ground a year ago," Sheriff Mills remarked, admiring the finished cabin and the new barn Daniel had begun constructing. "You folks have worked miracles here." "Not miracles," Daniel corrected, his arm around Julia as she held Elizabeth. Just hard work and hope. And love, Julia added softly, for his ears alone. Don't forget that part. As the afternoon lengthened into evening, their guests gradually departed, leaving the small family alone in the golden light of sunset. Daniel and Julia stood together on their porch, looking out over their land, the creek flowing strong with spring runoff, the cattle grazing contentedly, the foundations for a larger barn already marked out. "What are you thinking?" Daniel asked, noticing Julia's contemplative expression. She smiled, leaning into his embrace as their daughter slept peacefully in her arms. "I was thinking about that day I arrived, how terrified I was when I heard about the fire, how uncertain everything seemed. And now I know it was the best thing that could have happened to us," she said with conviction. "If you'd had the prosperous ranch you promised in your letters, we might have settled into a comfortable but distant partnership. Instead, we had to rely on each other completely to build everything together." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "From the ashes, something stronger grew. Not just our home," Julia agreed, "but our bond." They stood in companionable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to deepening blue. The first star appeared, bright and clear in the Colorado sky. "Make a wish," Daniel suggested, pointing to it. Julia looked at her husband, then down at their sleeping daughter, and finally at the solid cabin behind them, the home they had built together, the life they had forged from disaster. "I don't need to," she said simply. "Everything I could wish for is already here." Daniel turned her gently to face him, his expression solemn yet tender. "I promise you, Julia, that whatever comes, good harvests or bad, plenty or scarcity, we'll face it together, just as we have from the beginning." "Together," she echoed, standing on tiptoe to kiss him as the first stars of evening multiplied above their mountain home. In the years that followed, the Jackson Ranch prospered beyond their early hopes. Daniel's careful management of their cattle and land yielded steady returns, allowing them to expand their operations. Julia's garden grew into a productive small farm, with vegetables and herbs that she sold in town for extra income. Elizabeth was joined by two brothers, William, born in 1878, and James, who arrived in 1880. The burned cabin that had greeted Julia on her arrival became a distant memory as their home expanded to accommodate their growing family. Yet they kept the cornerstone from that first foundation, setting it into the hearth of their new fireplace as a reminder of where they had begun and how far they had come. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1885, as they sat together on the wide porch of their completed home watching their children play in the yard, Daniel presented Julia with a small wooden box. "What's this?" she asked, surprised. "Open it," he encouraged. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a gold locket. Julia opened it to find a tiny daguerreotype of Daniel on one side and herself on the other, taken during a trip to Denver the previous year. "It's beautiful," she breathed, immediately fastening it around her neck. "But what's the occasion?" Daniel smiled, taking her hand in his. 10 years ago, you stepped off that stagecoach into my disaster of a life and somehow saw possibility instead of ruin." He glanced at their children, Elizabeth now, a thoughtful 9-year-old who loved books as much as her mother. William, a sturdy 7-year-old already showing his father's way with animals, and 5-year-old James, whose mischievous spirit kept them all laughing. "Look what we built together, Julia," Daniel continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just a home or a ranch, but a family, a life richer than anything I could have imagined when I placed that advertisement for a mail-order bride." Julia leaned against him, watching the sun sink behind the mountains that had become as familiar to her as the back of her hand. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if there hadn't been a fire?" she asked. "If I had arrived to find everything as you promised in your letters?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "I think we would have found our way to this same happiness eventually," he decided. "But perhaps not as quickly, and certainly not with the same appreciation for what we have." Julia nodded, understanding perfectly. The hardships they had faced together had burned away pretense and hesitation, forcing them to rely on each other's strength from the very beginning of their marriage. What had started as necessity had blossomed into the deepest love she could imagine. "Then I'm grateful," she said simply, "for everything, even the fire." Daniel kissed her, a gesture that still held the same tenderness as their first embraces a decade earlier. "As am I," he agreed. "For the fire, for your courage, and most of all, for the woman who looked at ashes and saw the foundation of a future." As twilight deepened around their mountain home, the Jackson family gathered on the porch of the house they had built together, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them as they had faced all others, with determination, with hope, and above all with love.